Well, thank you all for joining us today, this afternoon, and welcome to the inaugural Listen Up event, a safe, respectable space for critical thinking. This event is a joint venture of the College of Rehabilitation Services, the Office of EDI, Faculty of Health Sciences, the Office of the Associate Dean of Research and Grad Studies in the Faculty of Law, the Interdisciplinary Master's Program in Disability Studies, Leslie Udell Consulting, and the Cerebral Palsy Association of Manitoba. The title for today's session, this afternoon's session, is MAiD, Medical Assistance in Dying, Social Inequities, Structural Vulnerabilities, and Why Does It Matter? We changed some of the language because we understand that it was unintentionally harmed some people and because of what it evokes. And for that, we apologize. But we want to acknowledge the crucial obligation to have this conversation today. We recognize that there are people who may be applying for MAiD because of issues that it was never intended for. We need to ensure that there are adequate safeguards to prevent that from happening and to ensure that people who do apply and get rejected are provided with the assistance and support that they need help in their time of despair. I want to welcome Knowledge Keeper Leslie Spillett.
Hello, everyone. Tansy, bonjour. My name is Gigi Goyabik. I am Painted Sky Woman, Makwa Dodem. I'm from, belong to the Bear Clan. And I am here on Treaty 1, where I've been a guest for like a long time, about 40 years now. And I've lived longer in Treaty 1 than I have in Treaty 5, which is my home territory. So I'm always honored to be able to sit with folks that are discussing really heavy but very important topics, and doing it in a way that is that looks at all of the various factors, including how those systems of oppression impact on people's lives. So how do I want to start? So, we know that these are very, very difficult conversations to have, but necessary conversations, because we want to ensure the most ethical and principled and person-centered approach to the work that is taking place in terms of policies around medically assisted death. And so I just wanted to honor all of the work that you do in your lives, especially those that are right kind of in the trenches of this work. I really want to honor that work that you do. And so I will just open up. I always tell people, because sometimes we talk about an opening prayer or an opening reflection. And in our way of thinking, we have, even though we may not be able to see and feel and touch those spirits that have left us, those ancestors that have left us, and be in communication with Creator. So the tobacco that Val has passed me yesterday, sorry I missed you, Val, that is a way that we call on those that are on the other side to be with us, to help us, to guide us, to inform us, to remind us that that what we do, that what we say today, that how we reflect on this conversation, that we do it from a place of love and a place of just genuine respect and care for one another's opinions. And so I say kina naskamet now, creator Gijimanatu Anachka Kizigaka for another beautiful day of creation. That is what I know right now as I look out my window and see life in various forms all around me. And I want to acknowledge the beauty of life that we've been given. I want to acknowledge that that fire, that medicine that travels the daytime sky and is bringing back that longer days and warmth and life back to our little part of the planet. And I also acknowledge that moon, that grandmother that travels the nighttime sky, for all of the work that she does to take care of our waters, not only the oceans, but even the waters that are inside of us, and just to acknowledge that relationship. You know, I always think of when we do this work to really our invocation is to have those that have passed on, those that are our relatives. We call them today to sit with us, to watch over us, to guide us, to ensure that every word and every thought and every action is done from a loving and kind and respectful place, but also that we have courage to say what we need to say what truth that lies within ourselves, and to listen deeply to those truths that other people share as well, and to all of those medicines that are in each of those. We call them grandmothers, those grandmothers that sit in all of those sacred directions to be with us during this time, and just to give thanks and honor for them. You know, I have 2 grandchildren, and I'm sure that we're all connected to loving homes and loving families, and so we remember those ones that are in our lives. And to give thanks for all of the kinships that ground us to this time, and just to acknowledge that and give thanks, deep thanks for all of that. And I guess lastly, you know, to remember why we do this work. You know, I guess sometimes people do it for, you know, because there's, you know, it's their passion, it's their expertise, but really why we do this work is so others don't have to do it, that those that come after us don't have to do it. And so while we do our work in our time here, so that others may have better lives and more fulfilled lives, and that absolutely no one should have to be faced with the choices of you know, determining their time of death because there's not proper supports in place. And so may we build a world where those choices don't have to be made. I say, in a way, Magana Duk, all my relations. I go say.
Thank you very much for those wonderful words to get us started today. I wanted to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and also on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect all the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnerships with the Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And like I said, thank you for those wise words to get us all going. Just a few housekeeping thoughts and before we get going. This event is being recorded. We are going to have a link on the U of M EDI website, and we are going to have some materials after the fact. There is a closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen, so if you need or you want that, please engage it. There, at the end of each session, we are going to have a Q&A, and we are going to try and combine some of our questions because we won't have time to answer all of the questions. There is a function at the bottom of the screen for questions and answers. Again, we do want to thank everybody for coming out, and we do want to start this conversation. This isn't really a presentation. This is a conversation that is starting. At this time, I would like to introduce Reg Urbanowski, and he is going to be our first session's moderator. Reg.
Thank you, David. It's an honor today to be here, and thank you for, I'd like to thank the Elder Knowledge Keeper for her words. I think they will guide us through the afternoon. We will have 4 panel presentations in this first panel. Each will talk for 15 minutes. And then after that, we'll have a round of questions that people can answer. And it gives me great pleasure to announce the first speaker on the panel today, and that is the Honorable Mary Lou McPhedran. She is a human rights lawyer, a professor, and activist, and she was appointed as a senator in November of 2016. And she's had many internationally recognized contributions that she has made to the field. So without further ado, Senator McPhedran, I'll turn it over to you.
I think I've just had a failure of my headset. Can you hear me okay? You can. All right. Okay, I will proceed then. I very much appreciate the invitation to be with you and to be part of this crucial discussion among so many of Canada's disability rights experts. And I also want to add to our land acknowledgement by acknowledging that the Parliament of Canada is situated on the unsurrendered, unceded territory of Indigenous peoples, the Algonquin and the Anishinaabeg peoples. And I want to also share an anecdote, brief anecdote. I made this land acknowledgement recently at an event on Parliament Hill. And a certain member of Parliament from Western Canada, whom I will not name, came up to me right afterwards and said, "I don't know how you could say that." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Why would you say that the Parliament of Canada is on unsurrendered, unceded land?" I said, "Well, because it is." And he said, "Well, I do not think that parliamentarians should be saying that." And I said, "Well, we'll just have to differ on that point." I was not in the Senate of Canada when Bill C-14 on medical assistance in dying was adopted, but I rose twice to speak against Bill C-7 due to the discriminatory nature of what I called a hasty, ill-considered bill. And I suggested that senators were giving best efforts to a bill that really should not have been before us. I noted that the government refused to conduct the legally mandated review of the current law first and used a lower court's deadline to propel BC-7 through Parliament. I noted that the government, in making its decision not to appeal that lower court decision, quickly heard from more than 70 disability rights organizations, including British Columbia Aboriginal Network on Disability Society, Council of Canadians with Disabilities, Canadian Association for Community Living, the Disabled Women's Network of Canada, Inclusion Winnipeg, Community Care Manitoba, Arch Disability Law Centre, and People First of Canada, representing the concerns of hundreds of thousands of Canadians living with disabilities, including many who live every day in racialized poverty. I urge the Minister of Justice to appeal, and this was part of the message that came from the coalition of more than 70 organizations. These cogent arguments for an appeal were ignored. Indeed, previous to Bill C-7, the Minister of Justice was advised that Canada's current medical assistance in dying regime that was supposed to be undergoing review already troubled the UN's former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, who, after her study visit to Canada, reported that she was, quote, extremely concerned about the implementation of the legislation on medical assistance in dying from a disability perspective, end of quote. This is regarding the previous bill, C-14. And this was before the end-of-life criterion was struck down by one lower court and used as a device for bringing Bill C-7 rapidly forward. When I spoke first on this bill 2 years ago, I said, let us also be reminded that expertise comes in many forms, not just from one professional discipline. The UN and Canadian disability rights experts speak to us in one voice, clearly alerting Canada that this bill is highly likely to produce dangerous and discriminatory situations that will happen to people living with disabilities, far from the notice of this chamber and far from our being able to do anything about their situations in real time. Now, the coalition has grown to over 90 disability rights organizations. And I speak here today, and this I'm still quoting from my speech to the Senate, to convey my own concerns and give voice in this chamber to this coalition, which includes numerous experts from numerous disciplines to be heard by all. Just days ago, 3 independent UN experts, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the independent expert on the enjoyment of all human rights by older persons, and the Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, all moved by serious reservations about Bill C-7, made public their formal letter to the Canadian government, identifying the human rights violations likely to occur if Bill C-7's expanded access to people with disabilities who are not dying is passed into law. Governments in Canada have largely failed, as Senator Pate and others have observed already, to invest adequately in implementing laws and programs to achieve a lived reality of substantive equality and inclusion in Canada. With this bill, we've entered a zone of making a law that contradicts promises that are constitutional and international guarantees of equality. This is why the 3 UN Special Rapporteurs have joined the Canadian disability rights defenders in calling out Canada and inviting us to listen. Disability rights defenders note that by not appealing the lower court decision on such a crucial life and death matter, the government has modeled this bill on one lower court decision, thereby entrenching stereotypes that will exacerbate stigma for many Canadians with disabilities, contributing to the adversity and oppression experienced by many members of this vulnerable group, to use the Senate terminology, without creating the just safe environments that are in keeping with promises in our charter and adherence to international human rights laws. Without the equalizing effect of the end-of-life criterion, which guarantees that the common thread among all persons who access an assisted death in Canada is that they are all verifiably dying, persons with disabilities will be able to gain access ultimately because they have a disability. A worse stereotype could not be institutionalized in law, that disability-related suffering, often caused or exacerbated by inadequate health and social supports and entrenched inequality, justifies the termination of a person's life. Do we really want to be part of sending the message that having a disability is a fate worse than death? Please consider, and again, I'm still quoting from my speech to the Senate, please consider that without my amendment, this bill will further violate Article 10 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which states, states parties reaffirm that every human being has the inherent right to life and shall take all necessary measures to ensure its effective enjoyment by persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others, end of quote. Canadians with disabilities are already bombarded daily with reminders that they are unwelcome and undervalued. Do we as senators want to compound the very real and present danger of harm in many of their lives, already exacerbated by social exclusion and poverty, by entrenching in law the message that they will receive our full support if they choose to die prematurely because our society has made many of their lives unbearable? Doesn't this message fit too neatly into the stereotype that a life featuring disability is a bad life, is a lesser life? Some of us in this chamber are persons living with disabilities. Some of us have known poverty and racial discrimination, but none of us in this chamber is living in entrenched poverty and social exclusion today. By offering medical assistance in dying to persons with disabilities on the basis of disability, I submit that Canada would be violating international law. After consultation with disability rights experts, many of whom are speaking at this conference, I moved an amendment that was challenged by the government and ruled out of order by the Speaker of the Senate. But here is how I explained the need for my amendment 2 years ago. Here is the crux of this amendment. There is currently no right for any Canadian who is not nearing death to access medical assistance in dying. Access to MAiD is created and regulated by law, but it is not a constitutional right. If we are determined to remove the requirement for reasonably foreseeable death, why are we not doing it for every Canadian, but instead creating a special right for Canadians with disabilities to choose to die? Is this not just one more example of separate but equal? A principle that the courts and human rights tribunals have completely rejected in Canada. Disabled Canadians have not found separate housing in institutions to be a benefit. They have not found separate entries through back doors or freight elevators to public buildings to be dignified. They have not found separate employment in unpaid sheltered workshops, or separate education in segregated schools, or separate transportation to be adequate, where inclusion and equality are goals and promises. What could possibly be the rationale for a separate right to assisted death exclusively for people with a disabling condition? Ableism, maybe? It is no small thing, no mere formality to reframe death as a benefit for the living rather than a harm but only for some, not for all who might desire it. The independent UN experts and the Canadian disability rights experts are not drawing from some separate theory of human rights floating out there. They are drawing from the same universal principles of human rights that Canada as a nation and our Constitution are built on. Those human rights principles clearly expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, upon which our charter is based, do not entertain and have not ever entertained the possibility that death could be a benefit for persons who are not otherwise dying. To categorize death as an accommodation for living persons based on their personal characteristics transgresses every norm of human rights known to law. Colleagues, this bill dresses up discrimination and calls it a right, but that does not make it so. This bill is discrimination on the grounds of disability writ large. Canada is already not taking, quote, all necessary measures to ensure the effective enjoyment of life by persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others, end of quote, in the words of the convention. For example, we saw how the government extended financial support much less and much more slowly for people with disabilities during this pandemic. In committee and in this chamber, senators have heard case after case of Canadians, including numerous examples from racialized Canadians, whose medical and support needs are not being met. Poverty and the insufficiency of life supports are causing them to consider, if not seek out, death, sometimes encouraged by healthcare providers. You know, I came to this chamber as a human rights lawyer and educator. You may not know I've been engaged in working with and in UN agencies. Please hear me when I tell you that such a strong, clear, joint communication to a specific government on a specific bill from 3 independent UN special rapporteurs is indeed a rare occasion of considerable note. Colleagues, who are we to ignore the words of these experts who said, in sum, we are deeply concerned that the eligible criteria set out in Bill C7 may be of a discriminatory nature or have a discriminatory impact, as by singling out the suffering associated with disability as being of a different quality and kind than any other suffering, they potentially subject persons with disabilities to discrimination on account of such disability. End of quote. Is it not deeply ironic that this bill states the following in the preamble? Whereas Canada is a state party to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and recognizes its obligations under it, including in respect of the right to life, whereas Parliament affirms the inherent and equal value of every person's life and the importance of taking a human rights-based approach to disability inclusion, end of quote. Canada ratified the convention in 2010. I was in the Great Hall of the UN General Assembly for the ceremony on that day, and this treaty has been a major catalyst in the global movement towards recognizing persons with disabilities as full and equal members of society. Canada's commitment to the convention has helped this country move toward the unconditional recognition in words that all persons with disabilities are rights holders, whose inherent human dignity is fully worthy of respect and investment in their capacity to live their rights. Under the present law, medical assistance in dying is permitted as an exception to the criminal code because a planned death is understood to be a benefit rather than a harm to a person who is dying and desires to control the manner and time of their death, a principle that I strongly support. By extending this formulation to persons who are not dying, Bill C7 advances the discriminatory proposition, and therefore that death is preferable to life and a benefit rather than a harm, not only when persons are dying, but also when non-dying persons have an illness, disease, or disability. And so I place before you an amendment to remove the clause that repeals the reasonable foreseeability of natural death provision in keeping with our international law and our Constitution. That amendment was ruled out of order. I close with this part of the program by saying that I look forward to the rest of the discussion, and I very much look forward to learning from the experts that are with us here today. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Thank you, Senator McFedrin, for those words. Those are very wise words that we will talk about throughout the presentation. And there will be an opportunity for questions to Senator McFedrin at the end of the panel presentations. But if you do have questions that you would like to write now, you can, and we are collecting questions. I would now like to introduce the next panelist, Elder and Knowledge Keeper Eric Crochane, who is from the Saugeen Anishinaabeg First Nation. Eric?
Bonjour. Dene Maganeto. As Debenes ego on. Mekanakan totem. Shugosung Beashe Dignified. My name is Eric Crochane, and my spirit name is Ashdebenes, and I'm from the Turtle Clan family. To start today, just let me give, I just want to say thanks for the invitation to come and speak a little bit of my work, and my work in relation to our people, our loved ones that that make the journey, you know, in life, that, you know, we live and we do our best in life, and then maybe sickness happens or something happens, and our journey becomes a search for medicine, or the search for cure, or a search for wellness or well-being, well-being of all of our being, our mind, our body, our spirit, our emotion, all of those aspects of our life. So I accepted tobacco to speak in my experience to this topic. I don't have a big understanding of the bills that are presented, or the bills that we're looking at. But what I can speak to is the journey of life, and I give thanks to all the many elders that past and present that aided in my understanding of assisting and helping our people in this walk of life, and this part, death. It's a conversation that it's sacred. It's a sacred conversation, and I know that in my upbringing and the things that I've acquired and paid attention to, and then the visions, just the visions of life, that in my journey here in the community of Saugeen, started when I was younger, and my teens, I started singing our sacred songs, remembering our sacred songs of our people. And a lot of those songs are happy songs, well-being songs. And then there's songs for searching for wellness, looking for cures for illness, looking for cures for just a betterment of life and understanding. In there, part of that journey, I was gifted with songs for transition songs to provide comfort when in our journey we've exhausted our search, we have exhausted in our journey the medicines, whether it be through westernized medicines or traditional medicines of Anishinaabeg people. And so sometimes in that journey, it has always come to me in a very respectful way, and it's always come to me with tobacco that some of the past elders that I've walked with, some of the past relations that I've walked with, in their time of their journey where they were preparing themselves to leave this world, they were preparing themselves for that journey to the land of our ancestors, the land of Creator. So in that tobacco, they were requesting them sacred songs, those songs that lead us on that journey to the spirit world. So in my walk, that it would include prayers, it would include song, it would include sitting and bringing comfort to our people, bringing comfort to our families, bringing comfort to our relations, giving comfort to the community, whomever. And so that's been a big part of my journey, and it's still my journey. And oftentimes I get still get the call. Still, I have tobacco that comes, and I'm asked by elders, or I'm asked by some people to come and share those songs with them, and also to help them in their journey. So to me, that's been a sacred, very, very sacred moment, and it's a very, very, very sacred time that it's fulfilling for me to be able to do that work for our people. And for this journey, just to share a little bit, like in my walk, and the sacredness that I'll speak of my parents, that in their journey and in them preparing themselves, that they had asked me to be there to sing, to be there to say the invocations of prayer, to speak them sacred prayers to Creator. And to me, that was very fulfilling, to be able to do that for my parents on their journey. And it was always involved of making them comfortable, and all of what they carried in sickness and their ailments and all of that. We walked with them, and we are always searching for that medicine. We are always searching for medicine to help them with with some of the diseases they had, or cancer or diabetes or heart affliction. So all of that, it was a long journey. It was a long journey of having medicines that kept brought wellness to some point. But in that journey, death was going to happen. So me being a leader of prayer, me being a leader of song, that I knew what function some of our songs carried. And so a big part of me was to help my parents with that. And then over the years, in my community, and even extends further than Saugeen, that oftentimes people would come from afar and bring their tobacco and ask me to come and share those songs of comfort, share those songs of transition, share those songs for our loved ones. And to me, that's something that I've always carried very respectfully, and never ventured too far beyond without the tobacco. So just like coming to speak here today, like I said, I don't have a big understanding about the laws that are in place, and but I do understand that sometimes in our journey we come to a place that suffering is happening, and in that suffering we want to do our best to provide some comfort, whatever that comfort may be. Maybe that comfort would come in a form of medicine, whether that comfort would be in a form of just human compassion and sitting with somebody, or sitting and praying for life, praying for giving thanks for the wonderful life that Creator had given us. And the important thing to remember, and in preparing for today and in preparing to speak in this panel, I smoked my pipe and called upon Grandfather. I called upon Creator just to give me permission to speak to that aspect of life that we know when Creator calls us to Himself, that we know that's when we leave this earthly plane and we move on to the spirit world. So I smoked this morning and meditating and just reflecting on the work that just happened in my walk. So that's been a big part of what I, as part of what I do. In our teachings, I know that our first and foremost search is always the search for medicine. It's always the search for wellness. The ceremonies of our people speak that they search for medicine for people, and everybody's individual is their own person. And so much of that medicine world that we search for is really unique to each and every person. It's very unique to each and every clan. of our nation. So that's a big part of that journey, is finding that medicine that works for our people. And then that's always our first and foremost walk in this journey, is to search for those cures for wellness. And I heard it in the invocations of elders, that when speaking to using our ceremonies or dance, or all of our ceremonies, that they're in search of that well-being. They're in search of that Minopamatizim, that good, kind road that Creator had given us. So I always want to remind myself, and that was the important thing this morning, that in my understanding, and what shaped me and shaped my understanding, and it shaped my world and my work in my community and beyond, was our creation and Creator presenting and giving us this life, giving us this breath of life, and setting us upon this Mother Earth to experience this beautiful creation that He had made, and experience all of what it is that we can experience. So in our journey and in our walk, in our own walk, we do that. We go out and experience this world. We go out and live this world. But in our teaching, we always want to be a kind person. That in our walk, that we're kind to one another, that we're kind to our family, we're kind to our relations, we're kind to all the people that we walk with. And so that in itself is work. That in itself is work to walk with kindness. And then in there, coming here today, a big part of that Minopamatizim, that good, kind road, is to be honest with ourselves, to be honest to the people. So coming here today, I'm not coming to tell you lies or tell you anything. I'll talk from my experience and the experiences that I've had, and in those experiences, I've gained a lot of knowledge. I've gained song. I've gained many great relationships. So keeping honest, right? So that's important. And then part of that Minopamatizim, good, kind road, is being a sharing person. That somewhere within me, I have some knowledge. I have some small bits that I can share with people, so that they feel good, or they feel good about in their walk. Or I share knowledge or medicine, right, to help them in their walk. So part of that Minopamatizim is to share. And then the last of this good road is faith, that in this we have a communication, with Creator, that we have communication with a spirit, or we have communication however we understand Creator and our relationship to being here on Mother Earth. So in our walk, it was simple, that we always have communication with Creator, and that we talk with Him freely. We talk with Him in times of need. We talk with Him in times of wellness. We talk to Him in all aspects of our life. So in those four words that I often, share and come from, that I'll always want to be a kind person. I always want to be an honest person. I always want to be a sharing person and a person of faith that I believe in Creator. So in my relationship, that's been my work. That's been my work with the people. That's been my work with helping people. And more importantly, is to share some of those sacred songs with our relations. They're very, very important songs for moments when we're transitioning from this life, when we're making that journey from this world, and we're making that journey to the spirit world. And how I understand those songs to be is that in this life, we have keys that open doors for us. Eh? We have keys that function and give us many functions in this world. Well, in our walk with the drum as Anishinaabeg, well, that drum, the heartbeat, Mother Earth, the heartbeat of life, carries us in this walk of life. It carries us in our journey, and in that heartbeat of Mother Earth, in there we find peace. In there, in that beat of life, we find cures for sicknesses. In that beat of life, we find comfort of our own spirit. We find comfort in whatever it is that we struggle with as a person, whatever we struggle with as a family, whatever we struggle with as a community, whatever we struggle with as a nation, that we call out, and then we use that drum to carry us to a good place. And it's through that drum, and song, that we receive gifts, we receive that wellness. So
Elder Crochet, I'm hoping that at the end of this session that you will have gift us with a song at the end of our session to guide us on our way. The words that you spoke today, I think, resonate with a lot of us. I think the good, kind road, and I think we've learned a lot from that. And if it's okay, we will open it up for questions when we're done, if people have questions for you. But I'm hoping as well that you will gift us at the end of this session with some of the song.
Yeah, I'll be more than happy to share that. Maybe a prayer
Yes.
for us, a prayer for all of what is taking place, what has taken place, and what's going to take place. I offer that good prayer for us.
Thank you so much.
And everybody that's in the field.
Thank you. I'd now like to go to the next presenter, and if you have questions for Elder Crochet, please post them in the chat session, and we will keep track of this as we move along. So I'd now like to introduce Alicia Ann Pauld, who is from Montreal. She's a Montreal-based activist, a public speaker, a writer, content creator, organizer, artist, sociology and sexuality studies graduate. And she uses her platforms to shed light on issues that are close to her heart. As a disabled queer Black woman, a lot of her work centers around ableism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, and biphobia. So welcome, Alicia Ann. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I am very happy to be here today. Thank you again for the invitation. I am truly honored to be part of this amazing group of panelists. As you all know, the name of this panel is MAiD is not the final solution for a broken social system, which I think is a very important title because it hits the nail on the head here, which is that MAiD is being used not to help suffering individuals, but rather as a way to address the lack of social and medical safety nets available for disabled people in Canada. We should put the blame on the system and not on the people who were wrongfully ignored by it and often left to drown. However, I would like to quote many Black activists. The last one that I've heard say this being Ava DuVernay, which is to say that the system is not broken, it was built this way. When the wait time for MAiD is sometimes shorter than to have access to resources and accessibility, that is a choice, not an accident that has led to a crack in the system. The problem brought up by activists is that most of the community's demands here are being ignored. Demands for accessible public transit, affordable housing, mental health support, easier access to healthcare, at-home care and support, etc. All these things are not given and are barely discussed. I want to address how MAiD is being used to cover up an ableist system, and more specifically, what areas constitute the system and how these areas are ableist. The three areas I will be discussing today are poverty, lack of social and medical resources, and a lack of accessibility. I want to say that, as it was mentioned, I lived in Quebec, more specifically Montreal, Jujage, which is where recipients of medically assisted death is the highest worldwide. And so my experience living in this province will be affecting my arguments. However, I'm sure a lot of you will be able to relate regardless of the province that you live in. So we can't talk about how disabled people are being failed by the system without talking about capitalism and how creating labor that is deemed beneficial for the advancement of the capitalist system is pretty much the only way for people to get by, but more specifically about how expensive accessibility and accommodations are for our community, whether that is in the day-to-day or if we want to have access to social life and leisure. When accessible housing is extremely expensive and rare, and when financial support for disabled people is small and so conditional, people are often forced into dangerous and or unclean living conditions or literally led into homelessness. Having to spend more money than the average able-bodied person on top of being refused the income necessary to afford those living conditions will inevitably lead to people reaching out for aid. When it comes to access to leisure and social life, when people have to pay more for transportation and have to put their adaptive equipment in harm's way to have access to the same leisure as able-bodied people, and then have to assume the financial damages likely to happen, disabled people often have to be more financially well off than others to have an enjoyable life, which again, frames MAiD to be the solution to the literal poverty disabled people are forced to live in, as well as the financial marginalization we experience due to the higher cost required from us. That obviously doesn't include how that then affects how we can or cannot afford other expenses like food, clothes, hygiene products, etc. When you're being refused access to essentials and leisure, and when the system makes it clear that they have no intention to make it better and acknowledge your needs in existence, MAiD seems like the only solution. Now, how can we change this? The first one should be to decrease the cost of living for disabled people to a point that is more similar to able-bodied people, and obviously then decrease that for everyone regardless. Disabled people having to pay more to be alive is a norm that needs to be abolished. We must invest more time and resources into allowing disabled people to flourish in the workforce and in school, whether that is in the arts, administration, academia, in the healthcare system, etc. We must allow disabled people to use their talents and skills to flourish in the fields that they truly want to occupy. and validate disabled lived experiences and disabled wisdom. We must hold accountable the people who destroy our possessions and no longer force us to pay out of pocket for the things that other people get to do and have for free. The second area I want to mention is linked to the first, which is that the system fails disabled people on a social and medical standpoint. By the way, it often requires us to pay from pocket in order to have access to medical care, accommodations, adaptive equipment, etc. Again, when the waitlist for MAiD is shorter than the one to have a wheelchair or safe housing, the choice is not one that can ever be taken in an enlightened way. When we refuse disabled people the essential and fun parts of life, which I would agree are also essential, MAiD seems like the final option for the people affected, but also to others who have been conditioned to think disabled people, and especially those who cannot perform as well within capitalism, don't deserve access to these things. In other words, when disabled people tell medical professionals that they can't find housing, can't afford food, struggle in school due to lack of support, and struggle to make friends because they don't have access to social life, these professionals rarely think of how the system fails us and instead decide that we are failing and cannot be helped. And we know the scenario to be true because people who have applied for MAiD have told us countless times. When we can't afford therapy or physical therapy, the solution has to be fund relocation into making that possible, not enlarging the conditions for assisted suicide. When there aren't people to support those support systems, the solution cannot be to abandon them even more, but rather it must be to invest money in those systems and spend time thinking about how we can support the people and employees that work within these systems. The last point is a continuation of the previous one, meaning that now I want to address the lack of accessibility and how community members are pushed into making the decision to go through with MAiD. When landlords and employers can refuse you accessibility, whether that is physical accommodations, working from home, having more breaks, etc., we're once again normalizing the exclusion of disabled people from the workforce, social life, and as experiencing homelessness. Physical accessibility and other forms of accommodations are often seen as extra steps or as special demands, and therefore, such framings will inevitably lead to them being refused, and that without any pushback from the public. As a Black queer woman myself, I cannot begin to tell you how often I have seen events, spaces be branded as safe spaces for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as being safe for the LGBTQ+ community or for women and feminine people, and have those spaces be located in an accessible venue. And these people simply not considering disabled people being able to enter those spaces as a necessity. Disabled people being excluded is the norm, and therefore, when we speak up about the exclusion we face and the lack of accessibility, we are often seen as unreasonable for simply wanting to have a place in the world. And then the anxiety and depression that comes from this is sometimes one of the factors that pushes healthcare professionals to recommend us MAiD, as opposed to taking action towards making accessibility the norm. People being told that if they can't find accessible housing, or if they are so desperate for an at-home lift, then they should just end their life, is something that should enrage all Canadians. However, it is barely discussed by the public. MAiD cannot be the final solution, but it is being portrayed as such. It is being portrayed as care, and I personally don't know how ethical that is. Similarly, MAiD being portrayed as a solution is incorrect to me because a solution implies a before and an after, but the whole point of MAiD is that there is no after. To me, MAiD seems like a solution for the government so that they can keep ignoring the people in need of support. The solution to ableism and inaccessibility is not the eradication of disability and disabled people. It is the protection of disabled people. We must work towards a future that values disabled life, and this cannot happen unless we destroy the idea that a future without disability in it would be a better future. Creating a world where not only disabled people get to live, but also grow old is essential, and to do so, we must radically change the social system we live under. I think it is not a coincidence that we consistently see elderly people be the face of MAiD, when in reality, there are more and more younger people applying for it every day and going through it every day, precisely because our social system is inadequate. People living with disabilities deserve to be seen as active participants of their communities because that is what they are. We deserve to be protected and not have our needs be seen as burdens. That is what, as burdens on the social and medical system. In fact, those systems must be reconstructed to do what they were always supposed to do, meaning take us into account. Building a world that protects disabled futures is essential if we want those systems, if we want medical assistance in dying to be an ethical service. Otherwise, it becomes a trap in which the more vulnerable will fall into, and our social systems that are supposed to act as safety nets then become slides felicitating the fall of many. I would like to conclude by saying that the disability movement cannot happen independently and as a standalone movement. It must be anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and fight for trans and queer liberation. When it is predicted that mental illness alone will be a qualifying factor for MAiD in March 2023, we must be extremely aware of how that will affect racialized people, LGBTQ people, poor people, and disabled people who currently are not eligible. We must understand how classism, racism, queerphobia, transphobia, and ableism affect our visions of futurity and how that affects the support we give to marginalized communities. Otherwise, it is likely that the marginalization expressed and experienced by these groups will be interpreted as a desire for MAiD, when in some cases, it is a cry for financial aid, housing, healthcare, and other forms of social support. Once again, medical assistance in dying may be the final solution in the eyes of a greedy government, but for so many, the solution is more support and a community that can act as such for its members. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. And I resonate with many of your comments, and I think you pointed out very well the need for social supports for people with disabilities that we will hopefully talk about as have all the other speakers. I would now like to turn to Krista Carr, who is the Executive Vice President of Inclusion Canada, which is a national federation working on behalf of people with intellectual disabilities and their families. Krista.
Thanks so much, Reg. Pleasure to be here today. Not so much a pleasure to be talking about this particular topic, but it appears the need continues and intensifies. I'd like to talk a little bit today about the journey of medical assistance in dying from a disability community related perspective, and the remarkable solidarity that has formed in the disability community as a result of the incredible and oppressive forces that are taking people with disabilities on a daily basis literally to the brink of death. And I know Alicia has, covered a lot of the ground on the social and economic inequity faced by persons with disabilities in this country. And it's a huge dimension of why medical assistance in dying is such an existential threat to the lives of persons with disabilities in this country. And the individual stories that we see in the media and that we certainly hear at our office and we're hearing in community every day have an even bigger dimension, because this particular law has forced the disability community, persons with disabilities, their family members, friends, and allies across the country to feel threatened, to feel violated, and to feel very much betrayed by society, by a government, and that, you know, this population is seeking so hard to be recognized as full citizens, and this has just made the struggle so much more difficult. And the fact that we're having an event at all to discuss this is an indication of the momentum that has, you know, increased over the period. I remember, you know, trying to talk to people about MAiD way back when it first started, and you know, we've really gained a lot of momentum from there in terms of people's, you know, people starting to understand more allies, more people. Just look at the quality of the individuals on this panel today coming together to say this isn't right, but yet we don't seem to be having the effect that we need to have. And it's an interesting comment on society and people with disabilities and how they're viewed, that we aren't having that impact and effect. So just a little bit, I guess, for me about the journey that we've been on here. And in 2015, when the Carter decision of the Supreme Court of Canada came down, Inclusion Canada, which we used to be called the Canadian Association for Community Living, was an intervener in that particular case. And our argument from a disability rights perspective was that we should not allow access, any access to medical assistance in dying at all. And the reason we held that particular view was because we were convinced then, as we have seen come to fruition now, that that crack in the door would literally just become a tsunami quickly and very, very tragically for people with disabilities. It would become, yes, in effect, to use the terminology, a slippery slope. Did we ever predict that it would happen as fast as it has, or with the intensity? And I don't think we could have ever predicted that. And when the Carter decision came down and basically, you know, the Supreme Court said to Canada, there needs to be access to medical assistance in dying in Canada. And the court did put parameters around that and talked about robust safeguards for vulnerable populations, et cetera, we worked as a disability community. This is what began to bring us together, was fear of what might come. And we started to coalesce as a disability community nationally and started thinking about, you know, what types of safeguards were actually going to keep people with disabilities safe in a regime like this, and came up with the imperfect but best thing we thought at the time was limiting medical assistance in dying to people whose death was reasonably foreseeable, which ended up being the terminology in the law, but basically to people whose death was imminent, who were suffering intolerably, and were looking to control timing, etc. And it's not a perfect solution. It does not actually completely keep people with disabilities safe. There are many people with disabilities in our communities across this country living every day with a disability that is considered to be a terminal illness. But they've been living for years, they're continuing to live, and they want to continue to live. So it's not a perfect criteria, but it is the great equalizer. It was seen as the great equalizer. It was seen as this is something that applies equally to everyone. And we were successful in getting Parliament to agree to that condition, and Bill C-14 was born, and that was the criteria. But very quickly, there was a push to expand, just as we had predicted there would be. And we were faced, even though we had been promised a review of the legislation, that hadn't happened, and we were being pushed based on a low court decision, which the Supreme Court or the government of Canada never adjusts the laws of the land based on a low court decision in one province in the country. But we decided to do that in the middle of a federal election. And we decided we needed to react to this particular decision, which actually we were not, it wasn't necessary for us to do. But that's the story that we told the Canadian public, the government told the Canadian public, and hence C7 was born. And this galvanized the disability community like nothing else. This brought together groups that had never worked together before, that didn't agree on other things, that, to try to fight Bill C7, which created the special pathway to death for people with disabilities who are not at the end of their natural life. And we call that Track 2 MAiD. And to the point where there was over 200 organizations that signed an open letter to government asking them to please not go forward with this discriminatory bill. However, we were ignored, and who was listened to was the general public. So again and again, the disability community heard that 80% of Canadians support this bill. And the problem with that is that 80% of Canadians are not affected, that they're not the ones affected by this bill. But the people we did not listen to were the people who were going to be the target of the bill. Their voices were dismissed. They were ignored. And we were told that we cannot fix the broken social system in Canada through the MAiD legislation. To which the disability community responded, but the broken social system in Canada is only one of the many reasons why we can't go forward with this type of system. We were told we are giving people with disabilities their autonomous decision-making capabilities. Well, I think it's important to examine the concept of autonomy. How much autonomous decision-making can you have when you're living in abject poverty? When you don't know where your next meal is coming from? Where after you pay your rent, you don't have enough money to eat for the rest of the month? When you lack the disability-related supports that you need? When you're isolated and marginalized and consistently discriminated against? And when you layer on the intersections of race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and the list goes on, the layers of marginalization are only greater and greater and greater. But we didn't want to listen to, we were not listened to on any level. We were giving people with disabilities their right to die, but it's a very special right, apparently, only reserved for those with disabilities and not for anybody else. And why is that? That is because too many people in society who do not have a disability view life with a disability as a horrible fate, as something nobody would ever want to have to live like, as a fate worse than death. And it's a terrible, I guess, story to tell about what society's views of disability is, but it's also added to this galvanization of the disability community across the country that, and it has also entrenched pain and terrible hurt and harm just by the fact that people with disabilities are now living in a society whereby one of their criteria, one of their personal characteristics that they live with has become a grounds by which to end their lives. And we will not solve in this country. We are never going to, you know, I've been told by many parliamentarians, well, yes, Krista, of course, you know, we need to work on our social system. We need to make that better. But in the meantime, we have all these people who are suffering intolerably, and we need to help them end their suffering. You can't possibly, if we think for 1 second that by bringing in MAiD legislation that allows people with disabilities who are not dying, who are suffering intolerably, who we know that suffering is caused by all of the systemic inequalities and social isolation and all of the things that we have created, nothing about them or their personal characteristics. We're going to offer MAiD as a solution for to end their suffering. We are never going to advance the social supports and systemic change we need in this country for people with disabilities, because it will become far cheaper and far easier to have them end their suffering through death, as opposed to giving them life and giving them the ability to live on an equal basis with other people in this country. And I think we have to think really, really hard about the kind of Canada we want. And it's sure not the Canada that I want my kids to grow up in or that I want to be part of. And at the very end of Bill C-7, we threw in at the very last minute for good measure an amendment that came from the Senate to add MAiD for people with mental illness. So MAiD for people with mental illness had been excluded from the law before this, and unless they had a mental illness and also had a condition where their death was reasonably foreseeable. But this added a whole nother dimension to MAiD. And I often describe it to people as, you know, what do we do when someone, you know, we find out that someone is on the bridge and they're ready to jump? We bring in every resource possible. We bring the fire department, we bring the police department. We all try to save that person's life. And when we get them off that ledge, we want to wrap our arms around them and get them the services and the supports and everything that they need, because we want to tell them they're valuable and their life is worth saving. And we want them in our society and we want them with us. But now we're just going to say, let's help you end your suffering. And so, and then we ended up with Bill C-7 being studied by the House and the Senate. Sunset clause was introduced, as I said, MAiD on the basis of mental illness would become legal after 2 years. We know the government has now extended that by a year, but that doesn't go far enough. We need to roll back the sunset clause completely. It was a mistake to legislate MAiD for mental illness at some arbitrary point in the future. And we also have been calling as a disability community for an end to Track 2 MAiD, a total repeal of Track 2 MAiD altogether, not just for people with mental illness, but for everybody that is covered under Track 2 who is not at end of life. And the disability community continues to be in solidarity, continues to be allied There are innumerable organizations and more being added every day, disability organizations, human rights organizations that are saying this is wrong and it needs to be stopped. But instead, we're also talking about expanding it now. We've just had a whole report come out from the MAiD for Mental Illness, the MAiD panel that's studying the expansion. And, we're talking about mature minors. We're talking about advanced requests. We're talking about, and we've now had a parliamentary report come out of that committee, and I know other people will talk more about this, but that's recommending no new safeguards for people with mental illness. They're talking about a panel to look at disability. Well, we've been talking about that forever. No changes have been made. And I want to just conclude by saying that there is a video. I think we are going to link it somewhere or post it later, that has been created in the disability community about persons with disabilities experience. It's a short YouTube video testifying in front of the MAiD Parliamentary Committee and the way they were treated and the way they were not accommodated, and the horrible treatment that they received trying to talk about their lived experience. Yet when other experts testified in front of that committee, they were treated with great respect and great deference. And I think that speaks volumes to why we are where we are right now in Canada with MAiD legislation. So I'd really encourage you to watch the video, share it widely, and please join the disability community in the fight against this horrible, awful law that violates their rights to equality and their right to life and their right to live on an equal basis with others. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista, for your presentation. You had many, many important comments that you made there that we will keep track of. We have a few minutes left. I think 15, David, that we could have a question period. And yeah, and if so, I'd like to maybe ask Val Williams if she can come up with some of the questions. We had many good points and questions put in the chat session. Unfortunately, we won't be able to deal with them all, but Valerie, are there some that come to mind that you would like to bring up now?
Yes, this question stood out to me. Why is autonomous choice only allowed when it comes to choosing means of death and not for means of life?
So I'll throw that open to the panel. Alicia, would you like to make a comment? Can I voluntold you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been looking at the Q&A and the questions that people have been asking as we were going, through. And I think this is really what it is. And I think almost, everyone pointed this out. When we're talking about MAiD, and specifically within this panel, we're talking about a broken social system. And so we're specifically talking about people who are reaching out for MAiD, not because they are in great physical pain, but because they cannot buy groceries, because they cannot pay their rent, because housing that is safe for their body and their body doesn't exist in the city that they live in. So we're talking about people who are being refused the right to live because they're being refused the means to live. However, we are giving them the autonomy and the choice to end their life and nothing else. And I think, again, this conversation is not about, and this panel in general is not about the specific people who are in deep physical pain and cannot have access to any medication that can alleviate this pain, even though there are medications that exist and people just aren't able to buy those, which is another conversation, or even medication that could be created, but because of lobbies and things like that, we don't think that investing money in creating those types of medication is a good investment. But again, another conversation. But yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of people, and that's the whole point of it, are reaching out for MAiD because they are too poor, or because the things that would help them doesn't exist, or being refused to them on purpose. So yeah, I think before we get to a point where we can really truly talk about autonomy and free will, we need to give people the right to live before we can give them the right to die. That's my opinion anyways. Thank you.
So you're muted, Reg.
Are there other panelists that would like to answer that question? Yes, Senator McFedrin.
Thank you. My answer is really, I guess, an invitation for even more engagement by disability rights organizations, individuals, experts on the current bill that is coming to the Senate, has been passed by the House of Commons, C-22, dealing with a benefit on the basis of disability. And there are a lot of us in the Senate who are very disappointed in this bill. We see it as being an important step forward and a good faith effort by Minister Carla Qualtrough to address many of the issues around poverty and exclusion that we've already addressed here today in the context of MAiD. And I hope that it's seen as an opportunity by many here today to really deeply engage in this. Some of us are going to try to make some amendments to this bill. Some of us have been in very active communication with many of you. However, this always comes down to what a majority of parliamentarians decide. So I don't want to divert our discussion today, but since so much of what we have been addressing is not being able to live with dignity and instead being offered to die with dignity, that this is not an acceptable choice, not an acceptable way for society to structure itself, to save money, etc. C-22 is actively before Parliament now, and I really want to invite engagement. I know many of you already are, but I wanted to flag this.
Thank you for those comments. Anyone else like to address that? No. Valerie, is there another question?
Yes, there is. After becoming disabled, death seemed better than life. Now, after 40 plus years, I would have regretted MAiD because of advancements in technology and medicine. Life is a lot more enjoyable. What would you say if someone like me chose MAiD because of their mental health?
Any of the panelists like to make a comment? I think it's a good response, perhaps, and poses some of the reflection that person had. So I thank you for that. Are there others, Val, or are we out of time, perhaps?
I would like to read a comment. There are so many good questions, and we do apologize. We're not able to get to them all, but there is a comment I would like to share with everyone. I really appreciate the panel presentation. After hearing Elder Kershane, it seems to me that Bills C-14 and 7 are about abandoning people with disabilities. I have heard that abandonment is our greatest fear from the beginning of life to the end. Elder Kershane's approach is the opposite. He walks with the person facing death. He is indeed a healing approach. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, David, we'll turn it back to you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Reg, and thank you to all the panelists for giving your perspective on the topics. We're going to take about a 15-minute break. So if we can come back at 5 minutes to 2, 1:55, and then we'll get going with the afternoon panel. And I wanted to again say thank you to everybody for showing up and starting this conversation. There's lots of work that we need to do, and we need to find a better Canada across the board and figure it all out. So let's take a break for 15 minutes, stretch, get yourself a beverage, and we'll see us all back here at 1:55.
Welcome to part 2 of the inaugural Listen Up event, a safe, respectful space for critical thinking. This event is a joint venture with the College of Rehabilitation Sciences, the Office of EDI Rady Faculty of Health Sciences, the Office of the Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies in the Faculty of Law, the Interdisciplinary Master's Program in Disability Studies, LUDEL Consulting, and the Cerebral Palsy Association of Manitoba. The title of this event is MAiD, Medical Assistance in Dying, Social Inequalities and Structural Vulnerabilities, Why It Matters. We changed some of the language because we understand that it was it unintentionally harmed some people because of what it evokes, and for that we apologize. But we want to acknowledge the crucial obligation to have this conversation today. We recognize that there are people who may be applying for MAiD because of issues it was never intended for. We need to ensure that there are adequate safeguards to prevent this from happening, and to ensure that those who do apply and get rejected are provided with the assistance and support they need to help them in their time of despair. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dakota and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. We dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. There's a few housekeeping events here, acknowledgements here. The event is recorded. There is closed captioning available at the bottom of your screen. Questions can be put in the chat. Unfortunately, we won't be able to answer them all due to time. Link and resources are going to be made available on the U of M EDI website. And with that, I will turn things over to Mary Sheriff.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Nancy, for the introduction and the housekeeping. And everyone, if you check, we will be again distributing all the links to things referenced, in particular the resources, as well as the video mentioned by Krista Carr. It's in the chat, and we'll post it again so you can find it. So it's an absolute honor to be here today with these speakers that we have today. Again, for this afternoon now, or this next portion, it's again a 4-panel presentation, and each panelist will take approximately 15 minutes each, and then we'll have another round of Q&A, and then we will wrap it up. So it's a great honor for me to be able to introduce our first panelist of this second panel, Catherine Frazee. Catherine Frazee is Professor Emerita in Disability Studies at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson. Amongst other things, she has testified before multiple parliamentary committees on the implications of MAiD for people with disabilities, and provided expert testimony on this issue in the Carter, LeBlanc, and Lamb cases. Dr. Frazee currently serves as an advisor to the Vulnerable Person Standard, a diverse national coalition of professional and civil society organizations seeking adequate safeguards to regulate the practice of assisted death in order to minimize those social and individual harms. So thank you, Dr. Frazee, for joining us today. And without further ado, Dr. Frazee.
Thank you, Mary. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Mi'kmaq, the unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq people, where I have the privilege and honor to live and to benefit every day from generations of careful and caring stewardship. It is, as Leslie Spillett reminded us at the beginning, another beautiful day of creation here too in Mi'kmaq. I took the opportunity to record my comments for this panel, so I think somewhere in the background of wizardry of this event, there will be someone who will activate that video. Thanks very much. Despite all of the red flags that surround it, MAiD is accelerating, expanding, and deepening its roots into the Canadian social fabric. We do not know where this will end. We are in the middle of what may very well be the most consequential chapter of Canadian disability history. Others who look back upon this time will surely say that disabled Canadians did not sit idly by, not through the 1990s when ideologies of so-called compassionate homicide infiltrated our homes, our neighborhoods, our social discourse, not through the 2010s when their proponents emerged again, no longer chastened by their defeats in Rodriguez and Latimer, their coffers now full, their influence more far-reaching, and their strategies more subtle. We are still defending our comrades, our ways of being in the world, our status as equal selves. But as the death cold creeps ever higher, there is no sign that the frenzy to expand MAiD to facilitate the premature deaths of more and more disabled people. There is no sign that that is losing momentum. In recent months, some strong investigative reporting has helped to clear away the fog of gaslight that government and medical spokespersons produce with their every breath. But that fog keeps rolling right back in. At best, we are offered symbolic gestures, like the amorphous and still distant Canada Disability Benefit, or more recently from the Special Joint Committee, the non sequitur recommendation that if the law didn't say the word disability, its ableist and eugenic implications would magically vanish. We can talk about these matters later if you wish, but for my time on this panel, I want to look in broad strokes at two core questions that are foundational for any interrogation of whether MAiD violates our human rights. Who is harmed, and what is the nature of that harm? To start with the obvious foundational point, there should be no controversy about this. Track 2 MAiD is only available to people with disabilities. Others who should know better may assert that Track 2 MAiD is simply designed so that people with disabilities will have the same rights as everyone else when it comes to medically hastened death. But that's not true. We already had equal access to MAiD, for better or worse, under track 1 at the end of our natural lives, the same as everyone else. What track 2 does, and what it does for disabled people only, is remove the fundamental safeguard of reasonably foreseeable natural death, and ensure that whenever we begin to despair of our lives, the state will help us die, and it will characterize our deaths as a benefit conferred under the law. But naming it a benefit does not make it so. Defending T2 MAiD, and yes, I'm using Gabrielle Peters' acronym deliberately here with all of its historical resonances, representing T2 MAiD as anything other than discriminatory on its face requires an acrobatics of twisting and turning equality on its end. The expanded version of MAiD that has fueled the fires of disability rights advocacy since 2017 confers not benefits but harms upon the community that it targets. Earlier in the symposium and in your own media feeds over the past several years, you have heard disturbing accounts of disabled lives caught up in the undertow of MAiD, both before and since the passage of Bill C-7. Those are the persons most directly harmed by Canada's MAiD regime. What can we say about the nature of the harms that these individuals endured? Clearly, many of their stories confront us with the assaults of poverty, its material deprivations, its relentless stresses. We have grieved the lives of comrades who suffered the double assaults of poverty and insecure housing, of entrapment in unhealthy and inaccessible dungeons, like the one my friend Sophia documented in a video recording before her surrender to MAiD. We have agonized as well at the thought of Chris Gladder's final days lying in soiled and foul-smelling bed sheets somewhere down a corridor of his long-term care home. We have witnessed as well the reality of lives given over to the particular assault of viable care denied, when you know that there are medications or therapies that would render life livable, when those treatment options are right there, but just beyond your reach. You are told that those options are for the wealthy, the folks at the top of the waiting list, those who happen to live somewhere else. But they are not for you. Madeline has spoken eloquently about this precarity, for she lives it every day of her life. Jennifer Hatch surrendered to it in the end. The T2 testimonials that we have before us have also made clear the insufferable pain of abandonment and isolation, of having no one to hold your hand, made vivid in the parting message of Rosina Camus. For obvious reasons, fewer of these cases make their way into public media, but they are out there. I have heard detailed accounts from credible sources of others, for example, young adults with speech and bodily impairment, now dead because they despaired of ever finding love and human intimacy. There is, of course, a complexity to all of these harms that we must unpack. Each of those I have spoken of so far was well entrenched in Canadian society long before the advent of MAiD. And yet without MAiD, and T2 MAiD in particular. Some of those people would still be with us. They could be here on this panel. None of them would have had their despair endorsed by the state. None would have had state agents dispatched to their homes to convert an ambivalent desire for death into an irreversible actuality of death. And let's not forget our disabled comrades who fell reluctantly upon the sword of MAiD too early on their path toward natural death. Given that the court in Carter expressed in its Section 7 analysis that Gloria Taylor's liberty and security of the person were violated by a policy that might result in her taking her own life earlier than she would want, we have to wonder what the court would say about Sean Taggart, whose visits with his son were his reason to live, or Satya Kovacs, whose sun-drenched sofa and faithful dog anchored her securely to life. Both Sean and Satya knew their time for living was short, but they wanted it all, every day of it. Yet when both and too many others like them found themselves without adequate supports to remain at home, they gave up those extra precious days of life to MAiD, rather than face the wrenching pain of being torn away from their homes and cherished relationships. There are still more harms to speak of, and other persons harmed. MAiD creates a broader circle of suffering for family members, loved ones, carers, health practitioners, and community. Identifiable individuals like Alicia and Christy Duncan, Trish and Gary Nichols, and many more. And the harm goes further still. For although it is cloaked in privacy, although investigations of questionable deaths are thwarted, death certificates are routinely falsified, and disaggregated data is all but impossible to obtain, still a MAiD death is not a private act. It is a public expression of state power, and its effects are felt well beyond the individual bedside. So in the moments I have remaining, let me leave you with a concept I first encountered 2 decades ago in an article by the international human rights expert, Fionnuala Neoline. Neoline uses the phrase communities of harm to acknowledge the ways in which human dignity is dialogically constructed. She writes that our own autonomous entitlements are precariously balanced with the well-being and safety of others. Similarly, I would say that our conceptions of belonging and self-worth, though individually experienced by each of us, are made meaningful by the knowledge that others who share our distinct disability experience have equal claim to that belonging and self-worth. When state authority operates to erase that certainty, all of us are harmed. So when we calculate the harms that MAiD has inflicted, and when we demand accountability for those harms, let's not overlook Neoline's communities of harm. We too are harmed by MAiD. We feel it in ways that are not equal to the harms of those directly struck down, but in ways that nevertheless must be factored into the remedies we seek. We are part of what Neoline describes as broader communal locations of entitlement. Those of us who observe, as we do, the actions of a state that funnels those who suffer and are powerless into the fast queue for death, we feel that sting of disability's devalued status, perhaps just as indelibly as MAiD's direct victim. It's something to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frazee. For questions for Dr. Frazee, please again post them in the Q&A. We can't get to them all, but we will try to get to some. And we'll just go now on to our next panel member, Dr. Trudeau Lemons. Trudeau Lemons is a professor and the Scholl Chair in Health Law and Policy at the Faculty of Law and the Dalla Lana School of Public Health of the University of Toronto. Dr. Lemons has written and lectured extensively on euthanasia and assisted suicide, otherwise in Canada known as medical assistance in dying, Part B, particularly on the developments in Canada, as well as Belgium and the Netherlands. And Dr. Lemons was as well an expert witness for in the cases of Truchon and Lamb. And he has testified before the Canadian parliamentary committees mandated to discuss draft legislation and the review of MAiD practice. So thank you very much, Dr. Lemons. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and the organizers for inviting me in this very important session. I want to start by acknowledging the land from which I speak here at the University of Toronto, which has been for thousands of years the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and which is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. I have today in my class on mental health, Susan Stewart of the Dene Nation actually talking to my students about Indigenous views of mental health. So it's a real pleasure to have heard also the very touching introductions earlier today and presentations before me. And if I may briefly introduce my short comments by saying that I was particularly touched by the reference to speaking about the ancestors and about the tradition of acknowledging the wisdom that comes from them and the need to look at what we know from our elders, but also from history. And I know that there was controversy around the original name of the presentation, but I remember when I testified before Parliamentary Committee on Bill C7 that I was in Berlin, and that I actually walked up to the day before, walked up to the memorial for persons with disabilities, not to say that we're necessarily talking about exactly the same thing, not to say that we're talking about the same ideology, but simply because we should not ignore the lessons that we can learn from the history, what happened in the past, how persons with disabilities in the context of this debate have been dealt with or have been disadvantaged, what historical and societal contexts may play a role in this debate. And I also certainly obviously think about the people I witnessed close to the end of life, my own parents. I try to often put something with me that reminds me of my parents and of what I learned from them and from my grandmother's assisting in her death and so on. So that's simply to congratulate and to say how touched I was by this particular reference and how I want to emphasize the importance of this. I also think, and this has been widely recognized, but I think not sufficiently, that we can learn from other countries, that we can look at evidence of what has developed in other jurisdictions that legalized euthanasia before Canada did. And this is also how I started participating in this debate as somebody from Belgian ancestry and being Dutch speaking, looking at what was developing in Belgium and the Netherlands since 2002. So these were the most liberal regimes in the world before Canada actually, I would say, quite quickly eclipsed them in terms of the openness of the medical assistant and dying regime that we have seen here. And when I testified about that, I talked about the fact that I was noticing that particularly since 2010, and this is actually important to say since 2010, because it's the evidence that was presented before the court in BC in Carter was evidence largely until around 2010, 2011. The case was in 2012. What we noticed there, and this is what I presented when the debate about what kind of law should be adopted in Canada, what I observed is that we've seen particularly since 2010, a significant increase in overall numbers, particularly compared to physician-assisted dying physician-assisted suicide regimes, for example, like in the United States, of a significant increase in overall numbers of people dying with euthanasia, making it clear that this was no longer a kind of an exceptional practice where the need was justified on the basis of the fact that there were people whose very significant physical suffering could not be addressed at the end of life. Interesting to see that they have now 3 to 5% of all deaths caused by euthanasia here in Canada, as previous presenters have pointed out, or actually in some provinces already bypassing that. We also saw there a significant increase of euthanasia outside of the end of life context, particularly since 2010. We saw euthanasia of mental illness, cognitive disability, that again developed after 2010. And we saw in the Netherlands an explicit concern which society was wrestling with, of euthanasia for advanced dementia without contemporaneous consent, which involved at times surreptitious medicating of patients and actually even the use of physical force of people who would no longer be able to consent on the basis of their advanced request. I particularly emphasized, and others have done so as well, that there was a shifting perception of the quality and the value of life in Belgium and the Netherlands. I mean, this is hard to prove in court. What exactly does that mean? But I think there were clear indicia that this was happening. We saw in Belgium, for example, how the Federal Review Committee developed the concept of polypathology as a basis for euthanasia, started to acknowledge that it was appropriate to end the life of people who suffered of so-called polypathology. Commentators in Belgium pointed out that this actually came down to a significant medicalization of old age, because what was seen as being polypathology, and I'm quoting here from one of the federal reports, was problems of mobility, including polyarthrose and tendency to fall, accompanied by pain and restrictions of the person's movement, quote, as a result of which people lose autonomy, vision problems and blindness that prevent the person from reading the newspaper, or watching television, which, and again, quote, makes the person dependent on care, has an isolating impact on maintaining social context. Hearing problems, which I certainly, but as somebody who without cochlear implants is deaf, find significantly interesting. Hearing problems up to complete deafness, which impede contact. Incontinency, which by many is experienced as undermining dignity. You see here the type of language that many people working on disability will say, ableist perceptions of a quality of life which disappears and for which euthanasia becomes the answers. Euthanasia became implemented for mental illness, particularly after 2010, where there was clear evidence in the scientific literature of explicit socioeconomic basis of suffering, including difficulties with work, insurance, isolation and loneliness, burden on others, so perception of being a burden on others, grief for the loss of loved ones and pets, which was documented as a basis for the identification of individuals with mental illness experiencing their disability, their mental health as creating unbearable suffering. Also evidence that it disproportionately impacts on women. We saw case reports of persons with disabilities receiving MAiD for the suffering associated with disability. And interestingly, which is a complex study that I can't explain here in detail, but we saw a study coming out in the Netherlands of a research group of Van de Wijngaard, which looked at 21,000 persons and came to the conclusion that approximately 0.18% of Dutch elderly above 55 years of age may or appear to have a desire to die. Majority less educated, many struggling with a variety of health issues, loneliness, a sense of being a burden to others and society. So these things were documented, were presented actually before Parliament and before the court. What did the Truchon decision do with this type of evidence? So I'm particularly focusing here on things I brought forward, but many other complex issues were brought forward, particularly in the context of mental health as well. You see that the Truchon decision started from a premise in an interim decision that we had already an evaluation of the evidence of what it means to have euthanasia legalized. And the production of evidence was actually explicitly limited for that reason by the judge, Justice Baudouin in the case. It also ignored this kind of suggestion, oh, we already looked at the evidence with the Carter decision. It ignores that there was developments since 2010, as I emphasized, and that we were dealing now with a different question. Namely, the question, why do we have reasonable foreseeable natural death, and what does it mean to restrict it to the end of life context rather than opening it up to other contexts? The Truchon decision also largely ignores the evidence about ableism, ageism, mental health, euthanasia. Why? Because it rejected from the start that the anti-ableist ageists goals of the law, which were explicitly in the introduction to the law, were not real goals, but were just value statements that didn't really have to be tested against the evidence. We see also in the Truchon decision a focus on individual rights claims, which glossed over the social context that affects how disabled persons, particularly those living in poverty, old age, indigenous identity, negatively racialized, may be contextually pressured and need protection. We saw a large rejection of the complex impact of perception and self-perception of disability old age, which is obviously hard to measure. It relates to the evidence of ableism, impact of ableism and racism, but there is some evidence. There is evidence of a social science nature that actually goes into that direction. The judgment also rejected the unique knowledge of experts who testified about capacity assessment and evidence of euthanasia cases of mental health in Belgium and the Netherlands. We can't discuss that here further. We see then Bill C7 coming out, parliamentary review and debate of the MAiD practice and expansion. And again, I simply want to flag here some issues. Bill C7 was pushed through in the midst of a pandemic which disproportionately impacts on isolated and impacted on disabled persons and against the strong opposition of disability community, as Christa and others have pointed out. It also was pointed out that the legally mandated review of the MAiD practice happened only after Bill C7, which is turning the way policy should be made on its head. There was also originally an extraordinarily short time frame for the review of the 3 years of practice and potential expansion in the last parliamentary review of MAiD, with limited discussion of the extensive reports of the Council of Canadian Academies, which were commissioned for the very purpose of the review of controversial areas that are now being recommended to be introduced. With respect to the parliamentary committee hearings, I was struck about how documented cases which have been brought forward here in the presentations were at least initially framed as anecdotes, not evidence. This type of argument has been frequently thrown at people who tried to raise concerns about how the ongoing practice was already impacting on persons with disabilities. We've seen in the hearings and then also reflected in the report, selective prioritization of questions to witnesses that support expansion, including on disability rights concerns expressed by disabled persons and experts coming with concerns about that. So the experts, the parliamentary committee members would particularly ask questions even to other witnesses than the witnesses who came forward with concerns about disability impact. We see aggressive questioning of the expertise, denying evidence as presented, while presentations in and of itself of 5 minutes and submissions of less than 1,000 words can hardly be seen as the proper way to really gauge what people have to say about very complex issues. And I also joined those who were troubled by often problematic ableist descriptions of persons with dementia or of persons' experiences of disability by some of the statements in the hearings. The committee report of 2023, I would say, requires more discussion, but it pays, in my view, lip service to the concerns expressed by disabled persons, family members, healthcare providers, and experts with concerns about the practice and concerns about expansion. Concerns that are in the report juxtaposed with longer and often prior discussion of reassurances and recommendations pro expansion. We see a selective ignoring of legal arguments. For example, there is a reference to the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, with a quote from experts who say that Bill C7 and advance requests for medical assistance in dying do not violate the convention, while arguments brought forward by legal scholars and advocates about the fact that the convention is violated by these practices were not even mentioned. So regardless of agreement, they were not mentioned, except in the minority report. We see, as Catherine pointed out, a blatant misunderstanding of why disabled persons are discriminated by Bill C7, as if the removal of the term disability will do the trick. And then in the end, we see recommendations, which I found again remarkable, about the need for in-depth consultations of persons and organizations of persons with disabilities, including Black, racialized, Indigenous, and young persons with disabilities, as MAiD laws and policies continue to evolve. But why didn't that happen before? In other words, full steam ahead, then we consult. I do not have to say what happened because we see already some of the things that have been discussed by others, the very significant increases, but I would want to simply flag here things that are largely ignored in the debate, like how come that we see these huge discrepancies in numbers between provinces? Is it because the nature of suffering across the country is so different, because there is such a different need for the practice, or is this something that should raise red flags? The fact that we have divergent numbers, much higher numbers in some provinces, and this very significant increase is experiences of suffering at the end of life as being intolerable, so significantly increasing that it has to increase, be responded by MAiD. Recent op-ed by Scott Kim, but also article by that I authored with Mary Sheriff and Leonie Herx, points to some of the unique components of the Canadian MAiD regime that are not significantly acknowledged. MAiD is framed by the government, by professional organizations, by expansionist advocates as a constitutional right, while the Carter decision explicitly rejected, and you can read that in the judgment, that the right to die with dignity would be a part of the right to life. The decision explicitly restricted the case. It decided at the time to circumstances of the case and did not deal with mental illness or minors. We see in that context of the use of the rhetoric of the right to die as a constitutional right, that healthcare providers' role has become reduced to informed consent and capacity assessment and verifying subjective criteria such as intolerable suffering and the decline of capability. Whereas contrary to the regimes like Belgium and the Netherlands, there is no need for all therapeutic support options to be put on the table or to be exhausted. In other words, I mean, they have to be put on the table, they have to be presented, but they do not have to be available necessarily. So there can be wait list of 10 months, but MAiD can be provided earlier. MAiD, in other words, has become framed in Canada as a medical care, which is, and some MAiD providers have even stated that with a certain pride, always 100% effective. Therapy, 100% effective, to be presented as an option to all, according to the Canadian Association of MAiD Assessors and Providers, who might qualify, unlike any other therapy in medicine. In other words, any person with a disability who might be perceived to suffer intolerably as a result of their condition and have irreversible decline of capability, would, according to that approach, have to be offered MAiD as a solution to their suffering. I simply want to flag here again that we have other evidence of concerns that we should notice from the Health Canada reports with all of their limitations about the data that they provide. We see that 57% of people ask for MAiD because of inadequate control of pain or concern about that. Talk to any palliative care specialist or pain specialist, they will say lack of control of pain should absolutely be hugely exceptional. It cannot be the case that 57% of people need MAiD to solve the concern about pain relief. There is another issue around that. And then you see concerns about terms that clearly reflect potential ableist nature or the potential, the risk that the promotion of MAiD for these kind of reasons has an ableist impact on perception of the dignity of others and self-perception of our own dignity. We see a significant number of people asking for for MAiD because they perceive themselves to be a burden, family members, friends, or caregivers, loss of control of bodily functions, isolation, and loneliness. I'm coming to the end of my presentation, but as already pointed out, it's hard to deny, and the MAiD assessors and providers has actually, as the article I have here on the screen by Alexander Rakin points out, recognized that the media reports that I also put forward here, the reports that were documented in the disability filibuster organized by Catherine Frazee, excuse me, and Gabrielle Peters, that the cases that they were documented, that these cases are indeed real and are there and are concerns that we have to take seriously. What have we seen in response? We see actually an increasing of an aggressive media campaign by the government on Twitter here, for example, to promote MAiD as a safe and practice that can be safely promoted, where we focus on the protection of those who may be vulnerable. We see also an explicit promotion of MAiD as an interesting tool to promote organ donation. I put here on the screen a page that has been distributed widely in recent days, and which shows that Canadian Blood Services and Nova Scotia Health Authority it has been sponsoring a movie that promotes the idea that people can donate their organs. I'm not against organ donation, but I want to put forward here that some of the language used in the promotion of this film really ignores the fact that the policy literature, the ethics literature on organ donation has identified well-documented concerns and dilemmas voiced in other contexts of organ donation, the need to separate the dying process from organ donation, the concern about subtle pressures on people who are in a dying process, the instrumentalization of the human body, again, without declaring, while being in full support of organ donation as a tool to save people, there are concerns about the aggressive promotion of MAiD in connection with other practices where there may be conflict of interest among the agencies promoting it. So in conclusion, people not approaching their death are already receiving MAiD. We're receiving it already before Bill C-7. Now we have, in the context of Bill C-7, this officially endorsed in law. That is turned into a universal therapy for suffering, regardless of other options and the source of suffering, including socioeconomic reasons. We don't know what will happen in the long term, how that impacts on perceptions and self-perceptions in healthcare context, which is already affected by ageism, ableism, colonialism, racism, and sexism, which Emil will discuss in a minute further. The response by the government has been further expansion, a trivialization of death as an outcome, more, not less, aggressive promotion of MAiD as a safe therapy, and an ignoring of the conflict of interest of those who are promoting it. We see a focus on ensuring access to death as a right, with a large glossing over the right to life and equal protection against premature death of disabled persons. Because that comes second. It is to be addressed eventually by other measures, which will always be incomplete, more expensive, easily deprioritized in times of cost constraints, measures which will not address the broader impact on perceptions, valuing of persons in societal and healthcare context, impacted by ageism, ableism, racism, sexism, and colonialism, and so on. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trudeau. Again, for anyone who's just joined us, please use the Q&A to put any questions, and then we will come back to those questions at the end of this panel. So going to our next panelist, we have Carrie Joffe, who is a human rights lawyer at Arch Disability Law Center. She has been involved in disability rights litigation at various courts and tribunals. Carrie's presented law reform and policy submissions about a variety of disability law issues to legislative committees, governments, and the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and has delivered extensive public legal education to diverse disability communities and guest lectured on disability rights issues. And I'd also mention that Carrie holds degrees in both law and social work from McGill University. So welcome, Carrie. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Mary. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you from Toronto today, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And I thank them for caring for these lands. As Mary said, I'm a lawyer. I work at a legal clinic called Arch Disability Law Center that specializes in disability rights law. And Arch has clients with disabilities in Ontario who have considered MAiD, applied for MAiD, and tragically, in some cases, died by MAiD. And I've provided legal services to some of those clients. I've also worked with disability organizations and disability communities from across the country on advocacy at the international level, talking about MAiD and its impact on disability communities in Canada. So that's the experience that I bring to this issue. And today, what I'd like to do is share with you a critique of Track 2 of MAiD from a disability rights law perspective. I think a lot of the comments that I have to make are very much in line with points that have been made by the previous speakers, but I'm hoping that I can orient some of those points within a disability rights law framework and an international human rights law framework for you. So as Krista reminded us, and I think maybe some of the other panelists, we're talking about, most of us here today are talking about Track 2 of MAiD, and that is the part of the law that allows people with disabilities, illnesses, and diseases to die by MAiD when they're suffering intolerably and they meet the other eligibility criteria in the law. Critical piece here is that you do not have to be near the end of life to die by MAiD Track 2. And so the first point that I'd like to make from a disability rights law perspective is that Canada's MAiD legislation does violate the right to equality in international law. This is a conclusion that I've reached based on legal analysis that I've done in my work on this issue. And as you've heard from other speakers today, disability communities from across Canada have reached a similar conclusion. But it's not just me, and it's not just disability communities saying this. The United Nations has also reached the same conclusion. As Senator McFedrin told us earlier today, in 2021, 3 independent UN experts sent a letter to Canada stating that Track 2 MAiD would have a potentially discriminatory impact on people with disabilities and older people who are not at the end of life or nearing death from natural causes. So let's try to unpack that a little bit. Canada has signed and agreed to abide by a number of international human rights laws. Many of those laws require Canada to ensure that people are treated equally and are not discriminated against based on personal characteristics like their race, their sex, their gender, their disability, and other aspects of a person's identity. One of those international laws, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is particularly relevant for us because it is a law that guarantees equality and talks about how equality is to play out from a disability rights perspective. It says that Canada must prohibit all discrimination on the basis of disability and guarantee to people with disabilities equal and effective legal protection. But when we look at Track 2, MAiD, it is quite readily apparent that Track 2 MAiD does in fact discriminate. It makes an explicit distinction between people with disabilities and people who are not disabled. And as other speakers have told us, and I am reinforcing, only people with incurable disabilities, diseases, or illnesses can get medical assistance in dying if they're suffering because of their disability and they meet the other eligibility requirements in the law. People who are suffering but are not disabled cannot get medical assistance in dying in Track 2. Instead, they may be offered suicide prevention programs, social services, or mental health supports, or in some cases, no services whatsoever. But they cannot be found eligible for MAiD Track 2. And it is in this way that the Track 2 law singles out disability-related suffering as a criteria for assisted death. This distinction in the law between the suffering of disabled people and the suffering of non-disabled people begs the question, what is it about disability-related suffering that is bad enough to warrant a physician's assistance to die? There's something about the lives of people who experience disability-related suffering that the law finds is less tolerable, less valuable, and less worthy of protection than the lives of people who experience suffering for reasons unrelated to a disability. And if we think about that, I think one can only conclude that what underpins the law is the negative perception that it is better to be dead than to live with a serious and incurable disability. And that is ableism. It is a devaluing of the lives of people with disabilities who live with suffering. It is this devaluing that is at the core of what violates the right to equality in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That convention requires governments to combat stigma and negative stereotyping about people with disabilities, and to recognize the dignity of all human beings, including those with disabilities. A law that devalues the lives of people with disabilities and reinforces negative stereotypes about living with a disability is in direct violation of these international human rights requirements. My second point is that from a disability rights law perspective, Canada's MAiD legislation violates the right to life in international law. Like the right to equality, the right to life is protected in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and in other international human rights laws as well. Assisted dying laws can be compatible with international human rights requirements, as long as they have strong safeguards to be sure that assisted dying is being done with free, informed, and unambiguous consent of the person, and to protect against any pressure or abuse. That is a requirement that the UN has set out as an absolute minimum standard for what is necessary to comply with the right to life in international law. Put simply, people must have free choice when deciding whether to apply for medical assistance in dying. MAiD must not be provided in situations where a person has been pressured or coerced. However, tragically, and as we've heard today, some people with disabilities do not have free choice. Instead, their choices are severely constrained by social and economic inequality. Many people with disabilities live below the poverty line. In many parts of our country, income support programs do not provide enough money to cover basic needs. Compared to non-disabled people, people with disabilities are much less likely to have work and much more likely to be homeless or underhoused. Many people with disabilities do not have access to safe, affordable, accessible housing, do not have sufficient disability services and supports to live in the community, or cannot get the specialized medical care that they need. And these barriers are, of course, exacerbated for people with disabilities who are racialized, gendered, or have other intersecting identities. The media has reported cases of people with disabilities dying by MAiD out of desperation because they are living in poverty, extreme isolation or loneliness, or being forced to live in an institution or could not get the services and supports that they need. And earlier in our session, Catherine told us a little bit about some of the experiences of those people. People in these circumstances who apply for MAiD are not exercising free choice. Without real options and access to adequate supports to live with dignity in the community, many people do not have free choice. If we understand the context of inequality that many people with disabilities live in, it is clear that Canada's law appears to offer freedom to choose medical assistance in dying. But in fact, there is no freedom of choice for many disabled people. This point is reinforced by Canadian law, which recognizes that an equality analysis must consider that some people may be disproportionately affected by structural conditions which constrain their choices. The Supreme Court of Canada has said that equality looks not only at the choices that are available to individuals, but at the social and economic environments in which they play out. And that is exactly the analysis that we are applying in the context of MAiD. One point that is often made by those who support Canada's current MAiD regime is that we don't have to be perfect. We know that people with disabilities live in conditions of systemic social and inequality, but we can offer MAiD while we work on creating a better society. And I think there are two important points I would make in response to those kinds of arguments. First, I think what's underlying this argument is a recognition that we do indeed have a problem with MAiD Track 2, that systemic inequality has in fact driven some people with disabilities to apply for and go through with MAiD. Second, it's important to remember what's at stake here. These are irreversible life and death decisions that we're talking about. The stakes could not be higher. And this calls for the most prudent and cautious approach possible. We cannot be perfect, but we must make sure that the utmost care is taken so that MAiD is being provided on the basis of free choice. And without a basic, adequate level of social and economic equality, people with disabilities, especially those who live in poverty, will be subtly or overtly pressured to consider, apply for, or go through with MAiD. At a UN conference about MAiD in June 2022, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities said that we cannot talk about free, uncoerced choice if we are not at the same time radically addressing social and economic supports, expanding healthcare and housing systems, and in short, giving people with disabilities the wherewithal to live the lives that they want to live in their communities of choosing. MAiD should not be an opportunity for us to work on improving social and economic supports for people with disabilities. Rather, social and economic equality for people with disabilities is a prerequisite. Another point often made by those who support Canada's MAiD regime is that the law has a set of safeguards designed to prevent abuse and ensure that decisions about MAiD are being made freely. And to this, I would say that the safeguards that we currently have are not effective at ensuring that everyone can exercise free choice. For example, for Track 2 MAiD, one of the safeguards requires that a person gives informed consent after having been told of available and appropriate means to relieve their suffering, and that the person be offered consultations with professionals who provide those services. Providing information about services and supports that can relieve the person's suffering is, of course, very important and something that absolutely needs to be done. But providing information does not address the very real problem that for many people, services they need, like housing, attendant care, adequate income supports, specialized medical care, are just not available, or in some cases are available only if the person is willing to wait many, many months or years. Finally, another point we often hear is that these concerns are not based in reality. It is just fear that the law will negatively impact people with disabilities. And I think Trudeau spoke to this a little bit in his presentation. To this, I would respond that this is absolutely not theoretical. It is not anticipatory. It is real, and it is happening to people with disabilities. We know that from the reports in the media. We know that from the people with disabilities and their family members who have testified before Parliament over and over again, attesting to the social and economic equality that they live with and that has driven them to consider or apply for MAiD or their family members. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me on this panel, and I look forward to your comments and your feedback.
Thanks very much, Carrie. I'm just keeping track of the time here. So we'll have another presentation and then we'll move into the Q&A, and we'll probably have around 5 to 10, not very long, but 5 to 10 minutes at least to tackle 1 or 2 questions and then wrap up. So last but not least, of course, is our next panelist, Dr. Emile Joseph, who is an associate professor in the School of Social Work at McMaster University. Dr. Joseph currently holds a professorship in equity, identity, and transformation from the Faculty of Social Sciences at McMaster University, and is the academic director of community engaged research and relationships with the Office of Community Engagement, also at McMaster University. Dr. Emile draws on perspectives of critical forensic mental health, MAiD studies, post-colonial theory, critical race theory, and critical disability studies to analyze the historical production of ideas about difference, normalcy, sexuality, eugenics, race, ability, and mental illness as they cohere, diverge, interdepend, and perform within policy, law, and practice. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Joseph. Thank you so much.
Hi, all. Thanks for having me. Thank you to the organizers. I'm speaking to you here from McMaster University in Hamilton, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations. These are lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And my attention to coloniality, well, you'll hear it in this rant of mine. You know, I've been told that talking about the historical context of discrimination against people with disabilities, the context of things like euthanasia and eugenics and colonialism in Canada, is somehow still too taboo to speak about during these conversations and proceedings around MAiD expansion. I've been told that legal, medical, and government officials would rather that issues with respect to MAiD expansion be spoken about as a matter of contemporary law and bioethics. The fact of the matter is that the very reason for the foreseeable death clause in the law and the exclusion of mental health or mental illness were specifically to protect us from ourselves via our histories of complicity with the things that others have mentioned: ableism, racism, saneism, systems of neglect, harm, even full formed projects of eradication or elimination. And I don't believe we can move on from that fact. So how do we allow for the law to be amended so that people experiencing unbearable suffering due to an illness or condition are allowed, access to MAiD without then providing systemic infrastructure that identifies disabled folks or conditions or illnesses as, a population permitted to be killed due to suffering caused by living in a racist, ableist, sanist society. And this is where the complexity comes in for me. When we were having conversations about removing the foreseeable death clause and targeting disability and mental distress, and how that allows for the idea of suffering for people with an illness or a disability or condition to be too loosely interpreted and assessed, thereby creating or perpetuating other forms of discrimination. And I've alluded to this a lot, the historical context that acknowledge that we already know that this is a fact, the historical case. We already know, from the first annual report on MAiD, that the assessment process did not assess nor account for the ways that our entire system creates suffering for people with chronic disease and illness and disability, in terms of how they access care, in terms of outcomes and access to income supports and adequacy of income support. And then others have raised the availability of supportive, affordable housing, the adequacy of services in the home, the quality of life that is allowed for them via the ways we provide care and services. And since that time, none of that has changed. And those omissions aren't accidents, in my opinion. They are entirely coherent with the historical trajectories of ableism that attach ideas of compassion to institutionalization, to eradication and exclusion. We also have a body of historical evidence that shows us that we have treated people with disabilities as burdensome and unworthy of adequate incomes or services. And these contexts could be assessed and addressed to alleviate suffering if we wanted to. I don't think we do. We could name who does this work and how with resources. We could, we would have to really seriously consider this and consider how these resources could be levied so that rights and needs of people are funded, resourced and protected. I feel like we also know that the kind of demographic data that would allow for an assessment and evaluation of how things that we know, systemic racism, a known reality, is impacting MAiD, how that data, is not collected, traced, or analyzed. And without these elements, we have permitted the hegemony of a medicalized idea of suffering to persist by omitting the social context of suffering while erasing the historical context and turning our gaze from the systemic ableism and racism and sanism that we know is persistent and pervasive across systems and services. And that's a very big problem. Elected officials and members of the Senate have heard testimony on this very thing from researchers, disabled folks, practitioners, legal professionals, highlighting these issues and others with MAiD expansion. There are dozens of op-eds and panels and submissions and policy briefs and recorded pleas. So now they all know on record that without assessing, the kind of social realities and the social context of one's suffering that could be assessed, that we have the reality of actually targeting those who experience ableism and racism via MAiD expansion. And as it is now, the idea of suffering for people with a chronic condition or illness or disability won't be differentiated in any way from the suffering they experience as a result of being mistreated, excluded, inadequately supported by a system that has historically impacted and presently impacts the quality of life for disabled and racialized folks. They know this. They know that this will result in deaths that disproportionately affect these groups. And that should have been more than enough to stop this. One suggestion, that I mentioned before was to collect social and demographic data. and data on social determinants of well-being. And that would allow for kind of monitoring of the systemic inequities that people are screaming about in the kind of application of this MAiD expansion idea. This, given what we know now, would amount, in my opinion, in a much too late and an egregiously unethical process of experimentation on the lives of disabled people, as they have not addressed the potential harms up front. You know, this MAiD expansion exposes a larger set of issues, and the way forward should not be to ignore them. If we want to collectively be more compassionate, more supportive in relation to MAiD, we can't do that without doing it elsewhere in society. If a health condition is unbearable, we also need to be working to support, research on ways to alleviate suffering, while funding services and improving people's lives. If the experiences of living with a condition or disability is unbearable due to unaddressed social needs, we need to commit to improving these things. And access to death shouldn't be the only solution or solution used to negate those needs. Safeguards can't be called that when they advance saneism, ableism, and racism. Removing safeguards doesn't help anyone. And this also includes confronting our past in our present, while also intervening to address the inadequacy of services, the things I've been talking about, the inadequacy of care that creates suffering systemically for disabled people. And this isn't about, and it shouldn't be about, political sides. We all need to be on the side of, I believe, integrity by being accountable to what we already know. And that involves acknowledging our own complicities in these systems and structures that advance, and the discourses that we allow to get advanced within them. Those really difficult stuff. And it's frustrating to talk about, when I've seen so many, even people on this panel that have been doing it for years. I feel like, the provisions in the law that didn't permit MAiD for individuals whose sole underlying condition was mental health or mental illness, it doesn't adequately account for how mental health and distress or suffering is experienced intersectionally by those living with, irremediable, otherwise medical condition. And those ambiguities exist broadly. So, for example, a clinician could understand, from a psychiatric perspective, that something like major depression can't be the result of a medical condition, but can occur in addition to, sadness or significant loss or financial issues or a medical condition. This is DSM stuff. But those clinical ambiguities can't be left as such in law. And that ambiguity not only permits, but designs a conveyor belt for MAiD to be used for people experiencing suicidal ideation, instead of responding to their needs with adequate services or resources, or responding to things that could be identified if you were to assess quality of life, what services people need, and resource those things up front. The law contained provisions that are necessary for a deeply historically, for deeply historical reasons, historically relevant ones, I would say. Specifically, the sections that include, the requirement for foreseeable natural death, the need for a voluntary request that is not the result of external pressure, things like informed consent and informing people of available means to relieve suffering. All those things exist because at some point, I believe, we told a story to ourselves that we had an ethical responsibility to heed to the lessons of the past. And those lessons, I feel like we omit time and time again because people are uncomfortable talking about them. I think about, in my own work, attending to the context of eugenics and euthanasia, and how these things have and should continue to inform how we think about any policy change that surfaces the idea that suffering can be addressed through policy and action that has any potential to be directed at those living with a disability or chronic or serious health condition. You know, many dismiss those particular historical contexts of euthanasia and colonial eugenics as aberrations, outdated, distant tensions, but you don't really have to go that far back in the histories of these lands to talk about some of these things. I use a few examples more often than others, how eugenic policies were supported by health professionals who advocated for policy restrictions that also included racist ideas on immigration restriction, marriage restriction, sterilization, segregation, that bring together the kind of confluence of ideas that help us think about the ways eugenics and ableism and saneism and racism operated together for purposes of nation building. I use the example of C.K. Clark, a psychiatrist who now the college in Spadina site of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health was once named after. And he argued for much of these same things, right? Restrictions on who could access services, identification of undesirables. And those ideas took root in law, you know, changed the Immigration Act in 1910. During this rise of eugenics, also a fear of newcomers and immigrants and refugees that was deeply rooted in racist ideas. These ideas that believed that newcomers and immigrants were carriers of some sort of hereditary defectiveness, that they were the carriers of criminality, that they were the carriers of mental health issues, disease, disability. I wonder if, you know, those who wish to continue to emit language around eugenics and colonialism and euthanasia engage with the history of Action T4, the Nazi euthanasia program that began with targeting children with disabilities in 1939. When we know that rates of suicide and self-harm, as well as inadequate resources, are materially disproportionate for many remote and indigenous communities. And we also know the contexts of forced sterilization of indigenous women on these lands. What does this MAiD expansion mean for those people? Many of the ideas advanced through eugenics that went as far as arguing also for euthanasia did so while using the words compassion and dignity to allow for the operationalization of projects of elimination to reduce perceived costs, to reduce what was constituted as threat or burden based on ideas that deemed some lives less worthy or desirable. And we can speak of these matters as Achille Mbembe talks about as necropolitical. So the ways the state rationalizes turning people into corpses. Those are the language he uses. I want to argue in the most stark terms that these matters are also fundamentally a question of that which is thanatopolitical. Jan Grew writes about this and has discussed, you know, thanatopolitics as you know, an entirely an issue that is a matter of using force against the vulnerable. The word, well, I can put it in the chat, thanatopolitics is concerned with not only the production of death, but the ways we fashion and manufacture what constitutes meaningful, voluntary, and a good death. Thanatopolitics helps us to identify the kind of false imposition of notions of rights and autonomy and safeguarding and rescue, and reveals them for their complicities with projects of making lives unworthy of life. And these contexts and their present day trajectories are exactly why MAiD expansion must not be rushed in any way and can't be left open for use for any perceived cost saving measure. It should not leave any possibility for the influence of any prejudicial idea of any individual health professional or administrator's perception of what constitutes compassion or dignity to influence a decision for medical assistance in dying for a person due to disability. That kind of targeting. You know, as people have raised, we know what the inequities are. We know the disproportionalities and inequities in social supports around income supports and housing and care in the home and otherwise that I've already talked about. I think, you know, if we don't attend to these things in particular in ways that engage all of the learnings from our historical past, we will end up reproducing them. You know, I wonder why we would continue to pretend that we have not already acknowledged and documented that systemic racism for people, for disabled folks exists in every facet of human life, and that systemic racism exists for disabled folks and then some in access to services, income, employment, education, healthcare in the forms of language barriers and access to culturally relevant care, access to interpreters, the pervasiveness of discrimination and stereotyping. These are known things that we know will impact the ways people experience suffering. And without any kind of attention to these, we negate them and only hold up this kind of uniform, over-homogenized idea of suffering. If we know this, why would we be trying to loosen safeguards in a law that is scaffolded by these very real contexts, whereby social suffering and racism and ableism and saneism can and has and likely will then be evaded in attention within assessments and applications for MAiD. There are, elected officials who also have chosen to evade a weigh-in on these matters, knowing all of this, because they don't understand how to take a position that might be something coherent with another political party that they're not supposed to agree with. Those people are not our allies here. They are not allies to life. And when we choose to leave systemic racism and ableism and saneism intact, and evade the kind of ways we talk about euthanasia and eugenics and coloniality, if we leave all that as is, and especially now in this matter of life and death, we open the door for an outcome of disproportionate, systemic, medically assisted deaths for these groups. And that is an atrocity. We got to take that in for a minute if we haven't already. We've watched time and time again the erasure and omission of attentions to these things that I've named, and those kinds of ways that those omissions get presented as administrative or legislative and procedural fairness. And these are then reproduced, leaving us to then ask for the data to show people that systemic violence is being reproduced, and watching everyone plead ignorance and throw their hands up. And there's no reason for this to proceed this way. Those necropolitical and thanatopolitical projects, I think people are beginning to, not beginning to, they have for some time understood, and those won't in any way just go unchallenged. We do these panels and op-eds and community conversations over and over again.
Okay, so thank
we'll
you,
continue.
Dr. Joseph. That's wonderful and very grateful. I think we'll have to stop there for a moment. We have maybe we can take 5 minutes, I think, before we get into our closing remarks from Dr. Nancy Hansen. Valerie, is there a question or a comment that kind of, and I do apologize, there's just so much to discuss, and it's a very complex and difficult and challenging area, but so grateful for all the panelists today who have taken the time to come and share their thoughts and their wisdom and their expertise with us. So Val, Valerie, is there one question or comment that we might be able to address before turning it over to Dr. Hansen?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. And I am going to ask Dr. Joseph because it was in line with your presentation. And the question is, how can systemic abuse, violent wellness checks, healthcare disparities and system violence, ableism, racism, and financial inequities be taken into account and legally addressed as a cause of suffering? And ultimately as a driver towards a decision to die through MAiD. So how can we address the systemic abuse?
I think if we were to take a different kind of approach to this altogether, a systemic approach wouldn't be looking for a way out. It would be looking for every way into considering what the context of one's suffering looks like historically, you know, in relation to their identity, where they live, how they live, and what they need, such that the assessment is not about their death, it's about their life. And when we do such a thing, we're asking questions about needs, and we're doing so from a place of respect that considers the person and their life as valuable. When you begin there, it does something entirely different. You might be assessing, you know, all the kind of social determinant kind of things we talk about, but also the context of those needs and how all of those things don't land equally for people as well. When you're making those kinds of assessments and you talk about suffering, you would have to design a completely different program or intervention that would then have to dedicate resources and services to meeting those needs that are unaddressed. It would remap, you know, so much of everything. We would have to listen to how people experience these things that we talk about, inequities and injustice and disproportionalities, depending on who they are, such that we might then intervene in ways that account for those things instead of using them to rationalize an end to it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joseph. So in other words, we need systemic change. Thank you.
I'm just wondering if there are any of the other panelists that might want to also weigh in on that question, in addition to Dr. Joseph, and thank you so much.
If I can say something, I mean, it relates to some extent to the unique nature of the Canadian system. So this medicalization of suffering is a very important component of I think the problem, and if you take seriously what the claim is, namely that it would be that we have to have death as a solution, death provided by the medical system as a solution to suffering, the consequences of that are huge. If you take that very seriously, and if you kind of say that's indeed the reason why we have to have MAiD, what kind of constraint does it impose on the basis of consent? If suffering is to be solved by ending of life, why then stop with people who can consent? So there is something incoherent about this broad promotion of death as 100% effective medical solution to the experience of suffering, and a remarkable glossing over the complexity of a concept such as suffering. Belgium and Netherlands, they also have as a requirement suffering, but at least there is some restraint as to what that means. Namely, physicians have to do what physicians normally do, is determining whether there is a medical, whether there are medical options to address problems that the patient faces. In our system, we have kind of glorified that as a 100% effective tool to solve the suffering of individuals without acknowledging the broader social context that indeed Emile pointed out is so, and others also, that is so profoundly shaping our own perceptions of suffering.
Thank you, Trudeau. Okay, so regrettably, we're actually, or fortunately for some, I suppose, we're close to the end of our time. So I'm just going to, again, thanks the panelists today, and just remind everybody, and I think, actually, I'll leave that to Dr. Hansen to remind everybody about where you can find the information. So turning everything over to you, Nancy, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. It's been a difficult and complex conversation, but one that needed to be had. And from my perspective, and I think the perspectives of many here, this is just the beginning. And I look forward to further discussions in the future in this listen up process, because I think we're all listening up at the moment. Again, thank you to all the participants, to the organizers, and if I can just ask Reg Ubaneski to introduce Elder Eric Crochet.
Thank you, Nancy. We think as a way forward in this that we are starting a journey together, because I heard this today that we needed to have a place of love and care, as Elder Spillett called it, in a good, kind road, as Eric Crochet talked about it. Eric, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you to close this session, please, with a song, and I'll let you speak to that. Thank you.
Bonjour again. I want to give my thanks to all that panelists, those that have come to listen. In sharing, just like Reg mentioned, this journey. In our journey is filled with lots of learning, lots of struggle, lots of personal development, lots of good life. But we also understand that part of our walk and life here is that part of our life is we're going to leave this world, and that's death. So, but in this walk, I'm smudging, and I'll share a song that we want to continue to pray. We want to continue to pray, talk, sing, share our knowledge, share this experience of life. I put it out there that we begin to start to share that experience of life with all of the Anishinaabe health professionals, or the medicine people, or the ones that seek medicine and hold medicine. So that needs to be looked at for our people, and for wellness, whatever those medicines might be. But I'll share this closing song, a healing song, and it came at a time, and we remembered it at a time when during the COVID lockdowns, that in that time there was lots of our people that were leaving this world without any care or compassionate, and it was just the nature of COVID. But within that time, we struggled to be able to pray, to be able to sing songs of comfort, sing songs of healing, sing songs for our people in their journey, and above all to be able to them to pray, and to be a part of that prayer when in their time of leaving. So the song as I sing it, I put it out there that the work that we do, that the work will continue to walk with our brothers and sisters, and in this journey, whether it be sickness, whether it be disability, or whatever it is the situation is for them, that will continue to walk for them and do the kindnesses to them, that there isn't no suffering, that within their being, that they're accepted, and there's no judgment of their walk and the decisions that they come to, but we support them and we help them. So for us that are advocating for their life and wellness and all the social issues, what we pray that those find we find solutions for our people that are suffering with that, our brothers and sisters. At the same time that we acknowledge that those that are in that end of time walk, that them too, we're there to support them and honor them and help them. So if you can join me and however it is that you pray or meditate, that for all of us in this work, that we continue this work in a good way, and that we're in the work for our people and the betterment of our people. Before I sign off, just for understanding what grandfather is saying, and it's the drum, and it's his voice that is sounding, and I'm helping him. But in words, he says, "Kinande mino na kiabe chinamian, kinande mino na kiabe chinagamomen." And then that's our prayer, our voice, our talk, that creator and creator's helper and helping beings remind us to continue to talk, continue to pray, to continue to seek that guidance, continue to seek that guidance for our walk, that we're always guided to make the proper decisions, to make proper life decisions for our people. And then he says, and that's to continue to sing songs of praise, songs of grandfather, songs within your heart, songs that flow from your heart, that we're singing for the people. We're asking for that, again, that guidance. We're asking for that comfort. That sometimes we might know all of the decisions that are at hand, but we ask kindly, we ask humbly, we ask for that guidance. We ask that we be guided in a good way, that we make the proper talk, the proper decisions on behalf of our people. So that's the song, and I share with you, and I thank you all for listening, and thanks for this. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Elder Erica. With that, I think we can close the session, David.